The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Alistair McLeod, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello, this is Alistair McLeod on behalf of Gold Money. And with me I have Dr. Barbara Kolm, who is director of the Austrian Economics Centre in Vienna. Barbara, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thank you.
We listened to Neil Ferguson last night, and he spoke in glowing terms about the Austrian economics and Hayek and so on, the Austrian connection, which is now very, very important to the world because it's the only form of economics which can properly explain the mess in which the world has got itself into. Now, I do know that my colleague, James Turk, interviewed you, it must have been about a year ago, and rather than go over old ground, I wonder if you could tell me what's happened for Austrian economics and understanding of Hayek's writings since then.
Well, the world has, at least the European part of the world, has changed a lot in the past year. Things have not gone to the better, unfortunately. However, the good news is that at least the Austrians, the Austrian School, the tradition of the Austrian School is becoming more and more relevant. People do not understand, or finally understand, put it this way, that the solutions of the old millennium that did not work back then do not work right now as well. So all the debt crisis that we are in, the mess of the welfare state, the money printing that the ECB has started already, clearly brings us to a position where it's either or. So hopping off the cliff or the disaster will even be worse. And this is where the Austrian School comes in again. The Austrians predicted all the bubbles and all the booms and busts that have occurred. This is a business cycle theory that started out in the 1920s in 1920s with Mises and Hayek developing this theory and working on it and explaining how all those bubbles burst and why a boom follows a bust and the other way around. And so these things become more and more relevant. So this is one thing. People start to think, okay, we do not have full information. They finally get it. You cannot predict things under the assumption of X, Y, Z. That's not the case. And the second thing why Austrian economics becomes more and more relevant is it's not only economic theory, it's social science. It embraces the individual, and the individual is the person who thinks and acts and who is responsible for his actions.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right. And certainly, I think the credit crunch really was a culmination of decades of the accumulation of debt hanging over from each previous credit-driven business cycle, and finally got to the point where it could no longer be sustained. Now, that has since then, over the last 3 years, morphed, if I can use that word, into sovereign debt. And we now have a situation where whole countries are facing complete economic collapse. I mean, it's obvious with Greece, but we try and explain Greece away by saying that, the politicians have been corrupt and all the rest of it, and that's why it's fallen apart. But if you understand Austrian economics, there's actually a far deeper problem in countries like Greece, and that is that they have existed on a sea of debt which is just created and created and created, and again, now that the whole cost of the banking failure is now on the sovereign's shoulders, we have a situation which is extremely alarming. Now, what interests me is, to what extent do you think politicians actually are beginning to understand this? Are they actually terrified about the thing and not telling us, or are they just covering it up and hoping the problem will go away? What's your feeling on that?
Well, they have tried to cover things up for far too long. They simply were not brave enough to tell the population, the people, the truth. They were not brave enough. They wanted to be re-elected and thought, we just solve it with the next credit. We just solve it. We just borrow another, for the next generation.
Yeah, print it again and buy some more time.
We reprint, buy time, and the next generation has to fix it. We don't do this. We want to be re-elected. We don't tell the truth. This is one thing. Second thing, of course, the situation has become worse and worse. Those welfare states, especially in Southern Europe, they grew to a dimension that is not understandable anymore. People rely on the state. They believe that the state fixes everything for them.
Yeah, but it's true also in the UK. It's true. This is true everywhere, Barbara.
They simply don't understand that eventually they will run out of other people's money, as Lady Thatcher once put it so wisely.
Yes.
And you can't redistribute forever. You have to produce something. And this is the point where it becomes difficult to be productive. And this is a big lack at least in Southern Europe and in many other countries of the European Union. They are not as productive and they are not competitive anymore.
But this is the fault of the state, isn't it? Because the state has just lent on the private sector and stopped it innovating, generating business. It's taxed it, it's regulated it. But this is all over Europe. I look at France, and do you see it's interesting.
France is in a big mess.
Yeah.
And look at the industry. How much is owned by government? And there are literally no private companies anymore. The small and medium-sized companies have ceased to exist. There is no entrepreneurship there. It's nothing. They rely on big government, on big government-owned companies,
and
the union. Exactly, the unions are very strong. I mean, what do you want with a public sector that is that large? I mean, there have to be fundamental changes, and you have to really put the reset button. And this is what Neil Ferguson pointed out so wisely yesterday when we had this big event, and he talked to the next generation. Said, the mobility you face and you have to perform is social mobility, and this can only be done by learning, education, and by putting the reset button. You really have to start rethinking things. You have to ask. Well, this is how we put it here at the Austrian Economic Center. You have to ask the question, what is the task of the state? What is the task of government? And limit this. Put this into question. We don't need this big welfare states anymore.
Yes, I think it's two questions. I think, firstly, there is the cost of the welfare state, which, as Neil pointed out last night, with longevity and all the rest of it, has grown beyond what anybody probably imagined when welfare states were first constructed. And I think the other thing is that understanding that government cannot replace the private sector and get the same economic output. So I think those are the two things. If I can move on just a little bit, because we now have a situation, it seems to me, as you rightly pointed out, the Mediterranean countries are in deep trouble. I think we've just agreed that France is a complete mess. The burden is being thrown on countries like Austria.
Austria and Germany, especially Germany.
Well, exactly.
We rely on German. Germany has always been our engine, our driving engine and the locomotive for our businesses, for our industries. Back then, when we did not have the euro, the shilling was tied to the German mark, and we were always in close relations. So you can put it into one basket, and our companies are as productive or not as productive as the Germans. So this is really right. It is one point. If we look that these countries will pay for the rest and carry the burden. However, there's one thing that we need to point out. The reasons why Spain is in a mess and why Greece is in a mess and why Italy or France is in a mess are completely different.
I agree, yes.
And, if we look at the debt, at the sovereign debt of Spain, it's much smaller However, the problem there is the private debt and the small cajas, which is the savings banks, who lent money to individuals and companies that were not safe. So this is a problem there. However, in Greece, the problem has more reasons. It's first of all the big welfare state. Second, being unproductive.
And huge government debt.
And huge government debt that has been growing and growing and growing. And, finally, they have not done their homework. They have not done their homework for years. When the EU stepped in 2.5 years ago, they should have started severe reforms. And they're still not going on. They have not started them.
But Greece is never reformed. Greece is never reformed.
Exactly. So there is no, just let them go bust.
This is. I think this makes sense, but that's not what the politicians are doing. I mean, we had this recent Troika visit, and what's come out of it is they will defer by 2 years to 2022 the target of Greece getting down to 120% debt to GDP, which caused huge, great laughter amongst the press corps. And was it Juncker said, "This is no laughing matter," which I think made them laugh even more. But it's this. For whatever reason, they cannot face this problem. Now, do you think that this is tied up with the situation with the banks? Because the banks have collateralized debt, and the collateral now is almost entirely sovereign debt. All the new debt that's been taken on is sovereign debt.
Yes.
So if you turn around and remove the very weak assumptions about that sovereign debt completely, then do you not have a banking crisis? Could this be why they can't address it?
Well, this is, of course, it has always been the argument for the past 2 years. And this is where it comes back again. There are banks that really need to go bust in Europe as well. They do not have the right to exist anymore.
But how do you let some banks go bust without having a complete systemic collapse?
Well, this is exactly the point where you have to be careful, and this is where Europeans or where we have not solved the problem by dividing either between retail banks and financing banks, by investment banks. We have not done that yet, and we should have done this as well. So also on this side, the homeworks have not been done. It's again a multiple problem. It's one hand, and one group relies on the others.
Absolutely.
And the others should solve the problem instead of coming back. It's us. If we are the first one to solve it, look at Iceland. Iceland is the best example. They solved their problem. It was hard for them, but they did it.
But with Iceland, you had a small community,
of course.
And when government fell apart, the community was there.
Yes.
I cannot say that for anywhere in Europe. I can't even say that of a lovely country like Austria.
Well, there is another country in part of the European Union, which is Lithuania.
Yes, which has made good progress.
Yes, exactly. And if you look at what happened back then, when the crisis hit Vilnius or Lithuania, they really started severe reforms. They cut salaries, not only of the politicians, but everywhere, and it really hurt the population. But now, after 2 years, the country is out of this crisis, and they're doing well again.
Indeed.
And I think it's a matter of being able to reform and face it. And the question is, how long will we wait? When will it become that bad?
Well, there is another aspect to this, which I think throws it in sharp relief, and that is, just imagine you're an entrepreneur in somewhere like Spain, with the government going bust, with the government coming up with yet more and more taxes, austerity, whatever it is, they are hitting the private sector in order to deal with the public sector problem. So as an entrepreneur, how can you invest in new production? How can you continue to invest in your existing facilities and get a return on?
This is exactly the point where you have to be a true entrepreneur, and you really have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to fight for it.
Yes.
And the trouble is, when the taxes are being risen each year, when you face more and more regulation, eventually end up at the situation that you say, it doesn't make sense anymore.
Well, we're already seeing this, as I understand it, with Portugal, because the young apparently are leaving there and they're going to Brazil and Angola, all the old Portuguese colonies, which now offer far better prospects than Portugal.
Those countries emerge. Look at the BRIC countries. I mean, but they know what to do to create a right environment for businesses to grow. And this is what we have completely forgotten in Western Europe, because even the four liberties are not working well that we have in the EU. I mean, look at the mobility of labor. I mean, Austria just opened the markets in May, finally, with a delay of kind of 8 to 10 years.
And in Britain, we're trying to close it up.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
Where are we? And it's a question also of where the European Union heads to. And bringing back the Austrians, and especially Hayek, we must prevent Europe from becoming a centrally planned by Brussels government or institution.
Yeah.
And this is where the small countries, the small states come in, and those are the ones who are more competitive, who can adapt to changes much faster. And this is the only hope we have.
There has to be an alliance of these countries, which brings me back really to the thing that just interests me and worries me, and that is, are any politicians across Europe getting it? Do they understand the Austrian approach, and do they understand, therefore, the true risks that they face? Is there any intercommunication between such politicians, say in Austria, in Lithuania, in the Czech Republic, Germany, wherever?
Well, if you look, especially you mentioned former Eastern European countries. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, they turned around 180 degrees, leaving communism behind and just building new institutions, building new things. And they did it in a very libertarian, classical libertarian way, really embracing competition, embracing markets, and letting the private individuals make their decisions.
They released entrepreneurial flair.
Completely. And this is a big hope. However, those politicians have not been re-elected. While those countries grew, they have come to a certain amount of wealth. And what do you face when you become wealthy? The welfare state starts.
They become morally corrupted.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so we do have an agenda here that does not match the Austrian school, unfortunately. So just to be frank, there are very few classical libertarian politicians in Europe, and their alliance is unfortunately not very strong.
Right, so however, it's still a struggle. Sorry, yes.
Young people, and we discussed earlier about the students, young people start to understand that there will be changes. And the question is also how social media plays in. Whether the old parties, the party system that we see now all over Europe, will still remain. Won't there be, and we have to ask us that, won't there be movements like whatever you name it, whether it's a Tea Party or you don't need this name, but this is an uprising of the individuals. And whether the individuals also in Europe will start asking questions and putting their fate in their own hands. And people understand that things don't go well. So when they start asking the right questions, I think then Europe has an opportunity to turn around.
Yes, okay, so really we have to hope that the next generation, perhaps spurred on by the cost of supporting us through the welfare state, might actually begin to think a bit more deeply than their fathers and mothers. Moving on, looking at the currency, how do you see this affecting currencies? I mean, what's your outlook on paper currencies? Is this something that worries you?
Well, if you look at what has happened to the euro is still a very strong currency. and it's still existing, although it has many flaws, many flaws when it was created, and we have not fixed that, unfortunately. As a matter of fact, the ECB has left their path of stability by printing. So I don't like this vision very much. I look at it with kind of.
It's very worrying.
Exactly. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. So it will have an effect on our currencies. The idea of inflating the problems away will not work out in the end. On the other hand, we have Switzerland with their own currency, very strong. And if you look how many billion they had to invest in the last year just to make sure that the Swiss franc is stable to the euro, just to
in other
survive.
Words, going down to the euro.
Exactly, to survive or to make sure that the Swiss businesses survive. So this is a real difficult situation right now. And the longer this goes on, the more difficult it will become. However, I think the euro will remain the way it is right now, unfortunately. There will be countries leaving the eurozone, definitely. And I wish we had a eurozone consisting of strong countries, no matter how you call this currency, as long as it is backed up. And this is the most important thing, and this is what I don't see right now.
So, actually, I mean, I think behind what you're saying, 2013 could be a very, very eventful year for Europe. We could have some countries leaving the eurozone because they're too weak. There may be pressure for the call it the more savings-driven economies,
yes.
Austria, Germany, Finland, the Netherlands, and possibly Luxembourg, forming their own bloc somehow. But getting there is very difficult because you've got an underlying banking consideration. What happens to all that collateral? How does this affect it? Is this going to drive some banks into bankruptcy? And then, of course, the other thing is that this sovereign debt is also collateral for a huge, great pile of derivatives.
Exactly.
Which is an unimaginable amount of money. And so, it could be a very, very exciting year, perhaps.
It will be, and we have elections coming up in many of these countries. Germany, Denmark,
yeah.
Austria. Well, Austria is a small country, will not affect, but the elections in Germany will definitely show us a way, either or, as the elections in the United States did. I mean,
but
simply...
are events going to wait for I think it's November, the election. Are events going to wait?
Yeah, it will be in fall, definitely. It will be in fall.
Yeah. But are events going to wait that? I mean, because they might have a momentum of their own.
Well, if you look at what has happened in the past 2.5 years, they have always by they I mean the politicians, they have always managed to postpone. And, just inject a little bit of money again, or it's not a little bit, it was a tremendous amount, but to inject money into the system again and just to keep it running. And I think they will put in fuel as long as it takes until the elections are over. And it will be a sovereign decision. The citizens are the sovereign. And it's upon us to make sure that the citizens, that the individual understands what is going on and what problems we are facing and what difficulties we are in.
Right. I don't think we're going to resolve the Eurozone's problems, but your thoughts on this have been very, very interesting. Lastly, can I turn to gold and silver? Do you see much quiet interest in gold and silver as a result of the turmoil, or is that yet to happen?
The interest in gold and silver has become bigger and bigger in the past months and years, actually years. And people seek for a safe haven.
And
I mean, it's not real
insurance,
estate
protection.
anymore. Exactly. It's not real estate anymore because we never know how much you can't take your
You
real
can't take
estate
your house with
on,
you.
Exactly.
Yes.
And what taxes will be imposed. So silver and gold have always been solutions to those who think in alternatives and think and act wisely.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, certainly we've found, I think, not just us at Gold Money, but also a number of other organizations who either provide facilities for storage or provide securitized forms of gold and silver, have seen that in spite of a period of consolidation, the ordinary man has still been quietly adding to his position. And of course, the Indians and Chinese have been doing this in increasing numbers. Well, also in the last year in increasing numbers. So they've used the fall in the price from the highs of about a year ago just to continue to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. And it sort of makes one wonder that when the average man in Europe wakes up to what's happening to his currency,
I think that
what's he going to do?
The people start understanding what is going on. If you look at the inflation rate, if you look what is going on, people start rethinking. And, you know, there is still a generation alive that has seen World War II and that has undergone a couple of changes of currencies and that have seen the value of gold and silver. And there's
an underlying understanding.
Exactly,
is what you're suggesting.
exactly, and this is what they have seen that, and you can be sure that those people tell it to their great grandchildren and to their grandchildren, and after all, they want security.
Yes,
they want a value that remains, and this is what gold and silver can provide.
Right. Now, Barbara, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to speak to us. How do our listeners find out a bit more about the Austrian Economic Centre?
Well, thank you, Alice. It has been a pleasure again to be with Golden Money. People find out about the Austrian Centre at www.austriancenter.com.
And it's centre spelled C-E-N-T-E-R.
Right.
Not
center.
The English way.
No,
okay.
yes.
Understood.
And also about the Hayek Institute, which is www.hayek/institute without E in the end. It's German, .at or .com.
Right. And I would think also that if you Google it, you would probably come across it.
Of course you will find us.
Barbara, it's been a great pleasure for me to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you as well.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.